There are moments in life when nothing happens on the surface, yet everything underneath begins to shift. That is how it started for me, not with pain, not with fear, but with a change in how people looked at me as though I had already begun to belong to the past. Illness does not always announce itself loudly. Mine arrived quietly, settling into my body the way dust settles on furniture that has not been moved in years. At first, it was only fatigue, a heaviness in my limbs, a need to sit where I once stood without thinking. The doctor spoke gently, choosing his words with care, and everyone around me nodded as if they understood. I did not nod. I listened. It was not the sickness itself that unsettled me. It was what followed. People began to speak to me differently. Their voices softened, stretched thin with a sweetness that felt borrowed. They asked how I was feeling, but their eyes did not wait for the answer. They lingered on my hands, my face, my breath, as though measuring something invisible. I noticed how often they watched me when they thought I was not aware, how conversations slowed when I entered a room, how laughter hesitated, then disappeared entirely, replaced by polite smiles and careful silence. The house I had lived in for decades felt unchanged at first glance. The same curtains stirred in the afternoon light. The same floorboards creaked beneath familiar steps, yet the air itself had grown cautious. People moved as though they were guests now, even those who had once treated the place as their own. They believed my end was near. No one said it directly. They did not need to. Their behavior spoke clearly enough. They urged me to rest more, to let things go, to stop worrying about matters that had once belonged to me. "You've done enough," they said kindly, too kindly. I had heard those words before, spoken to people whose usefulness was believed to be complete. At night, when sleep came lightly and left just as easily, I lay awake listening to the house. Walls carry sound in ways people forget. Doors whispered open and shut. Voices drifted down the hallway, lowered but not careful enough. "She seems weaker. She didn't eat much today." The doctor didn't really say, but you know how these things go. There was concern in their voices, yes, but beneath it, something else moved quietly. A brightness they tried to hide, a sense of relief that surprised me more than any cruelty could have. It was then I understood that sickness changes more than the body. It rearranges expectations. It gives people permission to imagine a world without you, and some imagine it too eagerly. During the day, I sat by the window and watched time pass without urgency. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching dust that had floated through every chapter of my life. Outside, the world continued without hesitation. Birds argued on the fence. Cars passed. Children laughed somewhere beyond the walls, their voices sharp and full. Inside, people hovered. They brought flowers that filled the room with a sweetness too heavy to enjoy. They asked questions that were not truly questions. Have you thought about getting things in order? Is there anything important we should know? You should rest. We'll handle everything now. Everything. I had spent a lifetime handling everything. Quietly, reliably, without complaint. And now, as my body slowed, they mistook my stillness for surrender. I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence had begun to reveal more than words ever had. In my quiet, people forgot themselves. They stopped guarding their thoughts. They spoke of the future as though I had already stepped aside. I listened. I listened to who visited alone and who only came when others were present. I listened to who met my eyes and who avoided them. I listened to how my name was spoken differently now, softened, stretched, as if it already belonged to memory instead of flesh. What they did not see, what they could not imagine, was that my mind had never been clearer. Illness had taken my strength, yes, but it had also taken my distractions. With fewer demands on my body, my attention sharpened. I saw patterns I had ignored for years. I felt truths I had once pushed aside in the name of peace. They believed I was fatting. But what was truly happening was something far more dangerous. I was finally watching. And in that quiet house, surrounded by people already preparing for a tomorrow they believed would not include me, I understood something I had learned too late in life, but would not ignore now. when others begin to celebrate your weakness. They are telling you more than they realize. They are showing you exactly who they are. And I was listening. I was not raised to speak loudly about myself. In the house where I grew up, survival left little room for such habits. My parents believed in work before rest, duty before comfort, and silence before complaint. Love was not something you declared. It was something you proved, day after day, by showing up even when you were tired. From a young age, I learned to carry more than my share. If a sibling struggled, I stepped in. If something needed doing, I did it without being asked. Praise was rare, but responsibility was plentiful. I mistook one for the other, believing that usefulness was a form of affection. When I married, it was not because I had been swept away by romance. It was because life demanded partnership, and I believed that love would grow from shared endurance. In those early years, we built everything from little. Money was scarce, and hope was careful. There were days when the future felt like a fragile thing we carried together, afraid to set it down too hard. Children arrived one by one, each bringing joy and fear in equal measure. I learned quickly that motherhood was not a role you could step out of when tired. It followed you into every room, every thought. I learned to wake before dawn to prepare the day, and to lie awake long after everyone slept, counting worries instead of sheep. I became skilled at stretching what we had. Meals grew larger than their ingredients should have allowed. Clothes were mended until the fabric itself seemed tired. I taught myself to need less so that others could have more. At the time, this felt like love, and perhaps it was. But love, when left unexamined, can turn into a habit that slowly empties you. As the children grew, so did the demands. School fees, illnesses, unexpected setbacks. Family members came and went, each carrying their own burdens, and I took those on as well. I was the one they called when things fell apart. The one who listened. The one who did not judge. The one who would manage somehow. Dependable, that word followed me everywhere. It sounded kind when spoken aloud, but it carried weight. Dependable people are rarely asked if they are willing. They are assumed to be. Years passed in this way. Quietly, steadily, I watched others grow comfortable leaning on my strength without noticing how it cost me. Gratitude faded into expectation. Help became a right instead of a gift. I did not protest. I told myself that this was simply how families worked, that love was measured by how much you endured. There were moments when I felt unseen, even in rooms full of people. Conversations happened around me rather than with me. Decisions were made with the assumption that I would adjust. I learned to nod, to agree, to smooth edges before they cut anyone else. I told myself there would be time later, time to rest, time to be heard, time to be more than the one who held everything together. Later never came. By the time my hair had begun to gray and my hands showed the marks of years of work, my role was firmly set. I was the foundation, solid, unmoving, something you stood on without looking down. And foundations, I would learn, are rarely thanked. They are only noticed when they begin to crack. I did not resent my family. Not then. I loved them in the only way I had been taught. But love, when it is always one-sided, teaches others a dangerous lesson, that your strength belongs to them. By the time sickness entered my life, they had long grown used to my silence. They believed I would continue to give, even as my body faltered. What they did not understand was that giving, when taken for granted for too long, eventually teaches the giver something else entirely. It teaches her to count. The sickness did not arrive with drama. There was no sudden collapse, no moment that split my life cleanly into before and after. It came the way night comes when you are not paying attention, slowly, gently, until you look up and realize the light has gone. At first, it was only tiredness, a heaviness in my bones that sleep did not touch. I told myself it was age, that the body was simply asking for kindness after years of service. I rested when I could and continued when I had to. That had always been my way. Then came the appointments. Waiting rooms have a particular silence, one that hums beneath the sound of magazines turning and numbers being called. I sat in those rooms often, my hands folded in my lap, listening to conversations that floated past without meaning. People spoke of symptoms and schedules as if they were weather reports. I watched faces come and go, each carrying its own private fear. When the doctor spoke to me, he chose his words carefully. He did not rush. He did not alarm. That, more than anything, told me the truth. Serious things are delivered softly. My family began to accompany me. At first, I was grateful. It felt like care. They asked questions, took notes, nodded at the right moments. But as the visits continued, I noticed how their attention shifted. Their eyes moved from the doctor to me and back again, measuring reactions rather than listening. I became an object of observation. At home, routines changed. I was encouraged to sit instead of stand, to rest instead of move. They meant well, I told myself, but kindness, when it is excessive, can feel like a cage. Meals grew quieter. Conversations paused when I entered the room. Whispers filled the spaces I left behind. I learned the sound of my name spoken in lowered tones. She's not herself anymore. She forgets things. She shouldn't worry about details. I did not forget. I remembered everything. The illness stayed with me, patient and unhurried. There were good days and heavy ones, days when my body cooperated, and days when it felt like it belonged to someone else. Through it all, I endured quietly. Pain does not always need an audience. What surprised me was not my own suffering, but the way it seemed to energize others. They visited more often now, bringing concern and stories and suggestions. They asked about symptoms, treatments, timelines. Always timelines. I sat in my chair and listened, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my face giving nothing away. I watched their expressions shift when they thought I was distracted. I saw anticipation where worry should have been. Hospitals have a way of stripping life down to essentials. Hallways stretch long and identical, as if designed to remind you that individuality does not matter there. I walked those halls slowly, leaning on walls and railings, while my family walked ahead, speaking in voices meant to sound hopeful. I realized then that illness had changed my place among them. I was no longer the steady one. I was the uncertain element, something to be managed, something that would soon require decisions. They spoke about me more than to me. At night, when the house settled and the day's performance ended, I lay awake and thought about all the years I had carried others without asking questions. Now, as I carried this quiet burden, questions surrounded me from every direction. How long? How bad? What next? No one asked what I wanted. The sickness did not take my dignity. People did that, piece by piece, without realizing it. They spoke for me. They decided for me. They assumed my fear and planned accordingly. What they could not see was that suffering had sharpened me. Each quiet day peeled away illusion. I began to understand that care can hide many things, and that attention is not always love. As my body weakened, my awareness grew stronger. And I began to notice who was watching the clock. There is a kind of kindness that feels like a performance. It arrives on time, wears the right expression, and leaves before it becomes inconvenient. I had known real kindness in my life. This was not it. As the illness settled into its long stay, people began to visit more often. Relatives who had once been too busy suddenly found time. Voices filled the house again, laughter returning in careful doses, as though rehearsed in advance. They brought food I could barely taste, flowers that crowded the room, and concern that arrived fully dressed. Hands reached for mine more often now. They squeezed gently, lingered longer than necessary. Words were chosen with care, softened until they lost their meaning. You're looking better today. You're so strong. We're all praying for you. I listened and I watched. Kindness, I learned, changes its face when it expects something in return. Conversations began to stop when I entered the room, not abruptly, just enough to be noticeable. Topics shifted. Smiles tightened. People glanced at one another as if checking their lines before speaking again. I became familiar with the sound of doors closing softly behind me. They asked questions that seemed innocent but carried weight. Have you decided what you want to do about the house? You've always been so organized. I'm sure you've planned ahead. It must be comforting to know everything will be taken care of. Taken care of by whom? They never said. I noticed how they spoke about the future now. Careful not to include me in it. Holidays were discussed in my presence as if I might not be there to see them. Plans were made with a gentleness that assumed my absence. What unsettled me most was the cheerfulness that crept in around the edges. Not openly, not cruelly, but there, like light slipping under a door. I heard it in shared glances, in sighs that came too easily, in the way some voices lifted when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Once, late in the evening, I heard laughter drift down the hallway. It stopped abruptly when someone noticed my door was still open. An apology followed. A quick explanation. But the sound lingered with me long after the house grew quiet again. I understood then that my illness had changed my value. Not in their words, but in their relief. To them, I was becoming something finished. They treated me like a delicate object, to be admired gently before being put away. They spoke of my strength in the past tense. They praised my sacrifices as though they were already complete. I did not confront them. Confrontation requires energy, and I was saving mine. Instead, I observed. I listened. I allowed their performances to continue uninterrupted. In my stillness, they revealed themselves. Some came only when others were present, their concern loud and visible. Some came alone, quieter, more careful, as though unsure of their role. And some, I noticed, came only to ask questions before leaving again. The house felt crowded and lonely all at once. At night, when I lay awake, I thought about how easily people confuse proximity with care. How being present does not always mean being there. I wondered how long they had been waiting for permission to stop needing me. Sickness has a way of exposing impatience. It stretches time, and not everyone is willing to wait. They believed they were hiding their relief behind kindness. They believed I was too weak, too tired, too distant to notice. But there is clarity in stillness. And beneath the soft words and careful smiles, I saw something hard and unyielding taking shape. Expectation. There is a strange freedom that comes when people underestimate you. Expectations loosen their grip, masks slip, truths wander into the open, believing they are unseen. They thought my mind was fatting with my body. They mistook my quiet for confusion, my stillness for surrender. In truth, I had never been more awake. I spoke less, yes. Words require energy, and I was careful with mine. But listening costs very little, and I listened constantly. I listened to what was said, and more importantly, to what was not. I listened when voices dropped in the hallway, when names were mentioned, then corrected, when plans were discussed in careful fragments, like pieces of a puzzle they did not want me to see whole. I learned who was impatient. I learned who was calculating. I learned who was kind only when witnessed. They forgot that I had spent a lifetime watching people. Years of raising children, managing conflicts, carrying secrets that were not mine to share had trained me well. I knew the shape of dishonesty. I knew the sound of false concern. I knew when love was being rationed. And I knew when I was being counted out. During the day, I sat quietly, my hands folded, my eyes half closed. They believed I was resting. In truth, I was noticing everything. Who sat closest? Who avoided sitting at all? Who asked about my comfort and who asked about my papers? Once I heard someone say, "She probably doesn't even remember what she signed years ago." The words were meant to be reassuring. They chilled me instead. They had already decided I was incapable. That assumption gave me space. I began to think carefully, not about death, but about truth, about what remained unsaid in my life, about how much of myself I had given away without ever being asked what I wanted in return. I thought about dignity, how easily it can be taken and how rarely it is returned once lost. I thought about silence, not the kind that erases, but the kind that waits. I realized then that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in a chair, watching the room rearrange itself around a false idea. They believed I was drifting. I was deciding. In the quiet hours when the house slept, my thoughts were steady and clear. I replayed conversations, weighed words, measured intentions. I saw patterns I had once ignored in the name of peace. And I understood something that surprised even me. I was not angry. Disappointed, yes. Saddened deeply. But anger requires heat, and I felt cold clarity instead. A calm that comes when illusion finally falls away. They had shown me who they were when they believed I no longer mattered. What they did not know was that I still mattered to myself. And that, I decided, would be enough. I did not rush my decision. Urgency belongs to fear, and I was no longer afraid. What I felt was something steadier, something earned through long years of being overlooked. Clarity does not shout, it settles. The idea did not come to me suddenly. It unfolded over time, shaped by what I had seen and what I had finally allowed myself to understand. I had spent much of my life reacting to others' needs. This, for once, would be an act chosen in stillness. I thought carefully about intention, not about punishment, not about reward, but about truth. I asked myself what my life had meant and what I wanted it to say when I could no longer speak for myself. The house was quiet the morning I made up my mind. Light filtered through the curtains, soft and patient. I sat at the table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands and felt no hesitation. I was not confused. I was not bitter. I was awake. Arrangements were made quietly, without announcement, without consultation. I did not ask for opinions because opinions had already been offered freely, without invitation. This was not a family matter. It was a personal one. The person who helped me treated me with respect. They spoke to me directly, not around me. They asked questions and waited for answers. That alone felt like a gift. As words were written and choices considered, I felt something loosen inside me. A tension I had carried for years, perhaps decades. For the first time, my voice existed on paper without interruption. I took my time, I reread, I revised, not out of doubt but out of care. Each decision felt deliberate, measured calm. This was not revenge. Revenge is loud and restless. This was alignment. I thought about who had walked beside me without expectation, who had shown patience without performance, who had loved me when there was nothing to gain. And I thought, too, about those who had mistaken my endurance for entitlement. Nothing was done in anger. Nothing was done to shock. I simply told the truth in the only language that would remain when my own voice was gone. When it was finished, I felt no triumph. Only peace. I placed the papers where they would be found when the time was right. Then I returned to my chair by the window and watched the afternoon drift past as it always had. No one noticed any change in me. They continued their careful kindness, their quiet watching. They believed they were still waiting. They did not know the waiting had ended. The day arrived without ceremony. No bells, no sudden silence, no sign that anything had changed except the way people gathered closer together than usual. Chairs were pulled in, hands folded, voices softened, already preparing for something they believed would go their way. I was tired that morning, but clear. Clear in the way only comes when nothing is left unresolved inside you. They sat across from one another, careful not to meet my eyes for too long. Some looked solemn, others strained to appear calm. A few wore expressions I recognized well, faces rehearsed in private, now brought into the open. They believed this moment belonged to them. The papers were brought out, names were read, words spoken plainly without flourish. There was no drama in the reading, and that was what made it unbearable for some. They had expected something else. A mistake, a softness, a return to the familiar order where I gave and they received. Instead, there was only truth. As understanding settled into the room, the air changed. Not with shouting, not with tears, with stillness. The kind that comes when expectation collapses under its own weight. One face went pale, another tightened, as if holding back words that suddenly felt dangerous. Someone laughed once, quietly, then stopped when no one joined in. I watched them carefully. I did not feel satisfaction, only a deep, steady calm. They searched my face for signs of confusion, of weakness, of error. They found none. I sat upright, my hands resting easily in my lap, my gaze steady. This was not an argument. There was nothing to defend. Questions were asked, but they sounded small in the room. Explanations were offered, but they came too late. Concern was rediscovered, but it rang hollow now, stripped of its timing. I spoke only once. "My mind has been clear," I said, "and my choices were made with care." There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just fact. Some looked away then. Others stared at the floor. A few looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, uncertain how to speak to someone who had stepped out of the role they depended on. They had expected gratitude. They had expected inheritance. They had expected silence. Instead, they were left with consequence. The room emptied slowly. Conversations were quiet, restrained, careful again, but now for different reasons. What had been anticipated for so long had not delivered the relief they imagined. I remained seated long after they had gone, listening to the house settle around me. It felt lighter somehow, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. Nothing had been taken from them, unfairly. Nothing had been given out of spite. I had simply told the truth when it mattered. And that, I understood, was enough. When the house grew quiet again, I did not feel alone. That surprised me. Loneliness had been a familiar companion for many years, sitting beside me in crowded rooms, following me through long days of giving without being seen. But now, in the stillness that followed the truth, there was something else. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on others behaving well, but the steady kind that comes from finally standing where you belong. Illness teaches you many things, but the most important lessons are not about the body. Sickness strips away noise. It removes urgency. It shows you who can sit beside you without needing something in return, and who grows restless when they realize you are no longer useful in the way they expected. I learned that kindness, when forced, carries a weight you can feel. That concern, when timed too carefully, is often a mask, and that people who celebrate your weakness will always call it something softer when speaking out loud. I do not regret the years I spent giving. Regret would dishonor the love that was real, the sacrifices that mattered. But I do understand now that endurance should never cost you your dignity. Silence, when chosen by others, can erase you. Silence, when chosen by yourself, can protect you. There is power in being underestimated, in being watched while you are quietly watching back, in letting people reveal themselves without interruption. Truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be placed where it cannot be ignored. My illness did not take my voice. It taught me when to use it. What I left behind was not punishment. It was alignment. A final act of honesty from a woman who had spent too long being convenient. If anyone felt hurt, it was not because something was taken from them. It was because something they had already claimed no longer belonged to them. I hope they remember me not for what I withheld, but for what I gave when it mattered. And I hope they understand, one day, that inheritance is not measured in property or possessions, but in example. Weakness is a dangerous thing to celebrate. It teaches the wrong lessons. Strength, especially the quiet kind, is often mistaken for absence. But I was never absent. I was waiting. And when the time came, I spoke the truth, calmly, clearly, and without apology.